Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you all for paying attention along the way. So, okay. Sharing my desktop, but okay. Let's see. I'm sorry for the clumsy start here. I'm getting some of the same hoppiness of slides that Kathy was talking about. There we go. I just want to give you a minute or two of context about the global R&E Federation work that's been going on for the last 10 years. To some degree, the work we're trying to do for the identity ecosystem broadly and for the NSTIC effort is a reflection of what we've been doing for the last 10 years in our community. We're some of the original authors of SAML, et cetera, so we've been at this for a while. And then I'll dive into the scalable privacy work that we're doing specifically. I can look at the privacy manager that Jeremy's mentioned at the beginning of our talk. And then I do want to mention a little bit about social to SAML gateways. I just got a very interesting report this morning that I'll go through about the kinds of attributes being released by the various social providers. We operate a social to SAML gateway inside our federation, and it's interesting stuff. We'll have one slide on interfederation, which is where we think the future is going to be. And then as Jeremy alluded at the beginning, we've been doing some work around trust marks and frameworks and a periodic table of trust elements, and been working with one or two of the other pilots now on reconciling some distinctions that we all have, and hopefully that work will become visible at the January meeting of the IDESG, and we're going to look for deep engagement around that. So this is a map of R&E federations worldwide. Again, just to show you the large-scale scope of the work over the last 10 years and the amount of deployment. Some of those federations that are marked in red or have actually moved to purple as they've become fully operational. This is a map of Europe. You can see the coverage here is very rich and full. I would point out that in some cases the R&E Federation has been extended to cover the general population. Denmark is a very good example of that, where in order to receive, let's say, government welfare, you need a federated identity account so that the money can be deposited into the right places, et cetera. Moving on, in common today is a vibrant federation with over 400 universities, probably 1 million assertions a day being passed around, but there is no central pipe to look at that. The uses are as people would expect. We're getting into some new uses as well, and in common has been certified by FICAM at LOA 1 and LOA 2. So we're very much aligned with the federal visions. Last background slide, just to show you the growth in common metadata over time. This is a bit dated. We continue on the exponential of growth in terms of the number of service providers, and there will be a stair step next year in terms of identity providers as some 2,000 community libraries join in common. That piece is in the works. So on to the grant. It's a 2+ year grant to Internet 2 and in common. We're depending upon the expertise of some of the best and the brightest in the R&E community. We have several focus points that we're about to dive into. And then we have a very public website. I would urge people to go to it frequently. It's got a lot of content on it, and it's growing. When I talk about the Social to SAML report that in a few minutes, we'll be posting that report to the public website as well as soon as we get the Creative Commons license on it. So we begin with the specific deliverables, promotion of two-factor authentication. Good privacy begins with good security. We are really selling MFA as a privacy protection mechanism through its good security stuff. Citizen-centric attribute activities for transactions, for accessibility, for social government purposes. Trusted metadata approaches. It's been a key part of the metadata bundle that you saw referenced earlier, is we carry trust marks about the various applications, and we also carry marks around the various identity providers and their willingness to release attributes to the to federated partners. We also carry the LOAs that various identity providers are authorized to issue. So the metadata is an extremely vibrant part of our life. And when I talk about interfederation in a few minutes, we'll be talking about moving from a very large static metadata bundle that we have today, probably 10 megabits of data, to a dynamic service, and that's echoing the move that the Internet did many years ago from etc.hosts to a DNS. We have a next-generation privacy manager. That's a very central part of our vision, as Jeremy alluded to. And one of the things that distinguishes this work is that we're trying to put the informed into informed consent. And lastly, we've been investigating a variety of anonymous credential technologies from both Microsoft and IBM. It's been challenging in all cases to get that stuff to work, but we're actually making excellent progress right now on that. One of our concerns, and I'll be talking about this, is that anonymous credentials as a technology promises unobservability. One of the characteristics that Jeremy alluded to in his preface. When we begin to introduce concepts like informed consent to anonymous credentials, do we dilute that unobservability, and if so, is it worth the price to get informed consent in at forsaking the fact that it is now known that somebody asked for information about a relying party? Has that broken the unobservability sets of issues? So we're beginning with a promotion of multi-factor authentication. We know about, I think everybody on this call understands the value of MFA in this space. Lots of alternatives are out there. I want to emphasize the tremendous leverage that federated identity and MFA provide each other. So that in early MFA deployments, if you went to multiple sites, each of which issued a token, you would have to carry all of your tokens around, perhaps on suspenders. When you move to a federated use of MFA, you have a single second factor token, and the auth and context field of the SAML assertion can pass to the relying party that they've had a multi-factor authentication. That also helps in terms of privacy spillage, because if your multi-factor device is biometric, and Kathy was certainly showing some biometric alternatives early on, you don't want that biometric information to leak out as privacy spillage, and if you do your authentication locally, you can be protected against that. So good stuff. We have two major thrusts. We've had a set of campuses that are actually testing code and testing technologies, and then we have a much larger consortium of institutions, over 40 schools, generating lots of interesting stuff about MFA and training the next generation of users to be MFA aware. So one of our goals, we recognize that we're a particularly interesting constituency in shaping next generation consumers. We want those next generation consumers to just assume that MFA is part of their space. So some of the issues that we've turned up is accessibility support for MFA. I would point out there's a new NSF grant looking at the same sets of issues, but clearly certain devices are not accessible for certain kinds of disabilities, and so we're trying to capture that information. There may be issues if you release your phone number to a second-party authenticator, to a third-party authenticator. Have I leaked some PII information out there, and what do we do about that? Cloud authenticators and DDoS attacks. There is some interest within the broad community about outsourcing authentication. If you outsource authentication into the cloud, then should you be under a denial of service attack, you cannot even authenticate to local applications. We have one institution that's a member of our a pilot group that on occasion gets denial of service attacks because of the nature of that institution. They have decided to keep authentication, both first factor and second factor, on their campus to avoid that DDoS attack. Alternative strategies when multi-factor tokens aren't available. MFA fails more frequently, if only for environmental issues. The student is on a dig in Tanzania. The doctor's in a shielded room. What do you do in those situations? So we have some procedures and policies that we're trying to make normative, at least within our community, about fallback approaches when you have done MFA. There could be a role for the IDESG in discussing and embracing some of these fallback positions going forward. And then lastly, we're trying to document the benefits of this. We see that they're large, but how do you capture that? We're also producing 3 important pieces of software. We produced an MFA handler for SHIB, and SHIB is probably the most widely used open source federating software. It's at play in a number of government federations, in a number of vertical markets. MLS uses it, the securities industry uses it, and now we have an MFA handler produced as part of the grant. We're doing the same for CAS. And then lastly, we're doing some very interesting work about open source client certificate lifecycle management. With this embrace of username and authentication, with this embrace of second factor tokens, we have not given up on PKI. We think it has some unique capabilities, and we're trying to enable it at scale. There were some websites on the page about that. In terms of the citizen-centric attributes, we've developed a schema catalog. It has several thousand attributes that have been gleaned from literally scores of schema out there. There's the URL for that. I would invite people to look at some of those attributes. If you click on the word name, for example, as an attribute, you will find that it's defined and redefined again in numerous schema with some significant variations about what the syntax and semantics of that attribute would be. All of this is vexing. All of this is loose and wild already, so it goes. We have some attribute annotated use cases up on our website. We did the first one working with Jim Fenton and the use case group. We are now doing a second one with NIST itself. NIST has a cloud and accessibility working group that is coming up with government standards for accessibility use in clouds. We've connected with that working group within NIST, and we are now working with them to develop an attribute annotated use case where the accessibility will be complemented by privacy management. We're going to be doing a cookbook to serve citizens, enough said. I want to highlight quite emphatically this global publicly inclusive infrastructure. If you're not aware of it, I have a slide coming up about it, but it is a international standard now of compensatory attributes. It's a very, for helping people with accessibility. It deals with 3 kinds of disabilities, the traditional physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and age-related disabilities. And instead of having to set your preferences on each and every device, this would be part of a set of preferences that you have. In the case of cognitive disabilities, the issues are particularly challenging. The NIST Working Group on Clouds and Accessibility have a number of compelling cognitive disability use cases. We're working with them. One of the distinctions of cognitive compensatory approaches is that you may need to reformat the content versus just change its presentation. One of the characteristics of cognitive disabilities may be an inability to do a depth-first search, so the content needs to be refactored into a different kind of linked structure. I would point out to the IDESG that this is a place where the case law out there is problematic for some of the content providers. And then we're doing this with the engagement of the privacy manager. Here's the GPII basic information. There's, in the schema standard, you'll notice it is an ISO standard. It is one of the very few ISO standards that is publicly available without cost. It is a compelling set of attributes. It is almost overwhelming, and so one of the other tools that the GPII group is working on is tools that would allow medical practitioners to, with a single click, generate a set of attribute values that are compensatory for a particular user. Well, we're doing this all with an UMA architecture, which would allow both online and offline use of those attributes. by relying parties, and we'll be doing a demo of that in the January IDESG sessions. Here's a bit of what we're hoping to learn in the next year in our pilot. I do want to talk about the distinctions between the social and RNE IDPs in just a second. One of the things we're trying to do is that hierarchical sweet spot where it's not clear that users want to manage, most users want to manage their privacy as actively as our tools will enable. So there's going to be a lot in getting the defaults right so that users don't have to do this, and that's going to be a part of our testing over the next year. And then internationalization issues always cover this. Let me step out of the slide deck just for a second to go over to the report on that a company we're working with, Cirrus Identity, is prepared about social to SAML gateway observations. Again, this report will be posted to our website shortly. This is a startup that is working in the identity space. We have a number of valuable interactions that converting social identities to SAML identities will benefit. You can begin to see in that second paragraph some of the observations. Some social providers assert email, others do not. Some make that email assertion single-valued, but for Windows Live, it's multi-valued. Some of this can be changed, some of it can't be changed, some of it is opaque, some of it is not. So this report is very rich with observations about what's actually happening out there in the wild. It'll be up on our page shortly, but one thing to take away is that the social identity providers typically do not provide fine-grained attribute release mechanisms. So as Jeremy said at the beginning, we may be having some consequence in them rethinking that position. They do not provide the informed and informed consent. I'll get back to that in a second. The Yahoo decision to recycle email addresses mean that some of these attributes may not even be persistent, and there are certainly relying parties out there who have made the assumption that the identifier that shows at the door is always assigned to you, and if that is not the case, it changes a whole lot. So let me go back to the slides now and continue the conversation. We're working on a privacy manager that will help users to release attributes. That privacy manager is protocol agnostic, so it's being engineered to work on top of SAML, but it will work on top of OpenID Connect. It will work on top of anonymous credentials as well. It's being carefully engineered for usability purposes. The group at Carnegie Mellon who's working on this is some of the best and the brightest in this Center for Usable Privacy and Security. Let's see. And so here are some of the design considerations. If you looked at that CMU tech report, you'd discover that over 90% of the social identity users do not understand what attributes are being released and or what the values of those attributes are or how to change that. That's despite the case that perhaps the best usability people in the world are at these social identity providers. So it may be a mismatch of marketplace values and capabilities, but that report is quite interesting, again, up on our website. Again, we're trying to get to both the informed into consent as well as accessibility issues. We talked about the technology agnostic aspect. We're going to do a lot of this stuff out of band. If an attribute release is the only thing between you and that GUI marshmallow, you might just click to dive in without being fully aware of what's happening. So one of our goals here is to provide out-of-band mechanisms. Another goal is to provide nudging techniques. We've all seen nudging as it applies to password strength. How does nudging as a concept apply to privacy management? Minimal disclosure for constrained purpose. That last aspect, constrained purpose, is perhaps the most difficult part of this problem space. Here is the alpha screen of the privacy manager. It's indicating what attributes are being released and the values of those attributes that are being released, but the most important thing in this screen is the little blue eye in the dot. That's the Tell Me More button. That's the informed and informed consent. And if you click one of those, here's what might pop up. We have to work greatly on the dialogues for this, but we're not presuming that the Tell Me More button and the informed and informed consent is coming from, let's say, vetted metadata about the relying party. We are engineering this so that the informed consent can also plug into a reputation system, so you can find out what your friends are releasing to this relying party, and then have that influence what you choose to release. That same I button can also plumb into enterprise sets of information, and we're just leaving an open door and an API there for informed and informed consent.
Hi, Ken. This is Laura. Sorry to interrupt. Your time is actually up, so if you could wrap up real quick and we can go ahead and move to questions.
Okay, so I'm going to pass over the anonymous credentials. In fact, I'm going to escape out and just go straight to the periodic table that we were talking about. Sorry to run long. This is a draft of the periodic table. It's up on the same website. The color coding indicates the kind of business issue it is, but that's fairly arbitrary. What's really important is the scale factors at the top apply to federated operators. The elements at the bottom apply to the interactions between actors in the identity ecosystem and individual users. If you want to build this a privacy mark from these elements, you might choose certain elements and certain values. This is a draft accessibility mark, and so it shows what attributes, what elements of the periodic table you might want to include in a definition of a trust mark for accessibility. The elements that aren't bolded are ones that you might choose to leave out, and trust that other trust marks are working on this. The last thing to say about this trust framework and trust mark issue is that we're beginning to get a convergence among some of the pilots on a common understanding of this. Typically, it's been done by those of us who've been operating federations for the last 10 years. As we get this growing understanding of what we think these things are, we are intending to take them back to the IDESG in the January meeting. There will be at a minimum a breakout session that will begin to talk about some of these distinctions that we're beginning to make around trust frameworks and trust marks and the specificity for that.
Hi, Ken. Can you hear me?
No,
this is Laura again. Sorry, we're gonna have to go on to questions, so we have time for enough.
That's fine.
At the end. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay.
I never have a time with Ken where I don't have more time I want to hear from him, but we do have one more presentation and also some time for general questions. We had two questions that came in while Ken was talking. One was, doesn't every IDP recycle addresses? I know all corporations do, even SSNs are recycled. How does that impact your plan?
Well, so two answers there. One is that it may well be that the login name isn't the preferred identifier to be using in these cases because it is not persistent. And so one of the things that we have done is we've written a discussion paper around identifiers and the various values and benefits that different kinds of identifiers have, again up on the website. So one takeaway could be that we should be using an additional identifier that will be guaranteed to be persistent. Another takeaway is that a number of our the institutions in the R&E space do never recycle email addresses. And so they're cognizant of these sets of issues. They're cognizant that email address is often used as a persistent identifier. They regret the fact that all the good email addresses are now being used up, and they're having to go to numbers at the end of the email addresses, but they will be doing that.
Great. And there was another question about noting that the UX will become very huge in real requests. Have you considered a fixed taxonomy of requests from reliant parties?
Great question. And in fact, there is a notion of attribute bundles that are emerging in the identity ecosystem. And we can see that now in FICAM, where FICAM is beginning to think about an attribute bundle for provisioning. We do have very distinct attribute bundles now in use within our community. One of the challenges about a fixed set of attributes is that when you go international, some of that may change. For example, in Europe, they would consider that an extremely important attribute to be released in most bundles is preferred language. Whereas here in the U.S., we don't even have that attribute widely deployed. So the bundles may be vexing in an international context, but they seem to be a normative structure. They're also very helpful when we're talking to a relying party. We present the normative bundles to them and say, is there a reason why you can't use one of these bundles? And we get data minimization as a result from that.
Thanks. Tom's also asking, where will this issue of attribute bundles be addressed within the steering group? We certainly hope so. We hope that the work that's being done in the pilots can help to inform it. But it's one of a number of issues that the steering group is going to need to tackle to make all this happen. Are there some other questions? And you can unmute your phone and speak, or type into the chat section. I'll wait just another minute to see if anybody comes up. In the meantime, Laura, if you can get the resilient presentation at least loaded up in place, since I know we're going to run out of time sooner than we want to, and there's always too much to talk about here. Any other questions from anybody?
Jeremy, I was going to ask if the speaker could talk a little bit more about the periodic table and some of how he sees it being used in the future.
Sure, we got a couple of minutes. Go ahead.
So
yeah, please.
So right now, there's some very heavy lifting going on between my team and at least one of the other pilots, and we're soon going to be bringing in Dayon and AANVA and the other pilots as well, to make sure that we're on the same page before we take this forward. So right now it's pilot muck, I guess is the best phrase. But it's coming together very nicely, and we have 95% agreement. We just want to make sure that on the 5% where we're not agreeing, maybe there is some synthesis. It's around, for example, trust mark development organizations, who can create these kinds of trust marks and what kind of vetting process might be there. What is the metadata of a trust mark? Interestingly, both efforts that are working on this space have decided on logos being really an important part of the metadata. In our case, because we want to pass that metadata through to the end user and the privacy manager. So the trust mark in the periodic table is under great reconciliation at this point. There will be a slide deck, that's a README slide deck up on the website that will talk about next steps as the question was posed. But we certainly are going to have a breakout in January at the Atlanta IDESG meeting where we're going to talk about trust frameworks, trust marks, and trust elements, and invite everybody to dive in. It's very positive to see the kinds of convergence that is happening now, at least among some of the pilots.
I would agree. You know, for what it's worth, we kind of developed something very similar in the National Governance Forum for the Office of the National Coordinator. We weren't as creative as you as coming up with a periodic table, though. That's really cool.
Well, it's just marketing. But, the intent here was to get folks thinking about this stuff. And
yeah, we got to make it a common lexicon that folks understand that here's equivalence or near equivalence or totally different subject when we're talking about these things. This is very valuable.
Great, thanks. Any final questions for Ken? All right, if not, to keep things moving, let's turn to our final presentation, Resilient. 20 minutes, and we should have a few extra minutes for general questions.